Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Chapter 2: The Function of Psychological Warfare.
Psychological warfare in the broad sense consists of the application of parts of the science called psychology to the conduct of war. In the narrow sense, psychological warfare comprises the use of propaganda against an enemy, together with such military operational measures as may supplement the propaganda. Propaganda may be described in turn as organized persuasion by non-violent means. War itself may be considered to be, among other things, a violent form of persuasion. Thus, if an American fire raid burns up a Japanese city, the burning is calculated to dissuade the Japanese from further warfare by denying the Japanese further physical means of war and by simultaneously hurting them enough to cause surrender. If, after the fire raid, we drop leaflets telling them to surrender, the propaganda can be considered an extension of persuasion, less violent this time, and usually less effective, but nevertheless an integral part of the single process of making the enemy stop fighting. Neither warfare nor psychology is a new subject. Each is as old as man. Warfare, being the more practical and plain subject, has a far older written history. This is especially the case since much of what is now called psychology was formerly studied under the heading of religion, ethics, literature, politics, or medicine. Modern psychological warfare has become self-conscious in using modern scientific psychology as a tool. In World War II, the enemies of the United States were more fanatical than the people and leaders of the United States. The consequence was that the Americans could use and apply any expedient psychological weapon which either science or our version of common sense provided. We did not have to square it with emperor myths, the Führer principle, or some other rigid, fanatical philosophy. The enemy enjoyed the positive advantage of having an indoctrinated army and people. We enjoyed the countervailing advantage of having skeptical people, with no inward theology that hampered our propaganda operations. It is no negligible matter to be able to use the latest findings of psychological science in a swift, bold manner. The scientific character of our psychology puts us ahead of opponents wrapped up in dogmatism who must check their propaganda against such articles of faith as Aryan racialism or the Hegelian philosophy of history. Psychological warfare as a branch of psychology. Good propaganda can be conducted by persons with no knowledge of formal psychology. The human touch, the inventive mind, the forceful appeal, things such as these appear in the writings of gifted persons. Thomas Paine never read a word of Freud or Pavlov, yet Paine's arguments during the Revolutionary War played subtly on every appeal which a modern psychologist could catalogue. But war cannot, in modern times, assume a statistical expectation of talent. Psychology makes it possible for the able but ordinary statesman or officer to calculate his persuasion systematically, and to obtain by planning those results which greater men might hit upon by genius. What can psychology do for warfare? In the first place, the psychologist can bring to the attention of the soldier those elements of the human mind which are usually kept out of sight. He can show how to convert lust into resentment, individual resourcefulness into mass cowardice, friction into distrust, prejudice into fury. He does so by going down to the unconscious mind for his source materials. During World War II, the fact that Chinese babies remain unimpeded while they commit a nuisance, while Japanese babies are either intercepted or punished if they make a mess in the wrong place, was found to be of significant importance in planning psychological warfare. See below. In the second place, the psychologist can set up techniques for finding out how the enemy really does feel. Some of the worst blunders of history have arisen from miscalculation of the enemy's state of mind. By using the familiar statistical and questionnaire procedures, the psychologist can quiz a small cross-section of enemy prisoners, and from the results estimate the mentality of an entire enemy theater of war at a given period. If he does not have the prisoners handy, he can accomplish much the same end by an analysis of the news and propaganda which the enemy authorities transmit to their own troops and people. By establishing enemy opinion and morale factors, he can hazard a reasoned forecast as to how the enemy troops will behave under specific conditions. In the third place, The psychologist can help the military psychological warfare operator by helping him maintain his sense of mission and of proportion. The deadliest danger of propaganda consists of its being issued by the propagandist for his own edification. This sterile and ineffectual amusement can disguise the complete failure of the propaganda as propaganda. There is a genuine pleasure in talking back, particularly to an enemy. The propagandist, especially in wartime, is apt to tell the enemy what he thinks of him, or to deride enemy weaknesses. But to have told the Nazis, for example, "You Germans are a pack of murderous baboons and your Hitler is a demented oaf. Your women are slobs, your children are half-wits, your literature is gibberish, and your cooking is garbage," and so on, would have stiffened the German will to fight. The propagandist must tell the enemy those things which the enemy will heed. He must keep his private emotionalism out of the operation. The psychologist can teach the propaganda operator how to be objective, systematic, cold. For combat operations, it does not matter how much a division commander may dislike the enemy. For psychological warfare purposes, he must consider how to persuade them, even though he may privately thirst for their destruction. The indulgence of hatred is not a working part of the soldier's mission. To some, it may be helpful. To others, not. The useful mission consists solely of making the enemy stop fighting, by combat or other means. But when the soldier turns to propaganda, he may need the advice of a psychologist in keeping his own feelings out of it. Finally, the psychologist can prescribe media radio, leaflets, loudspeakers, whispering agents, returned enemy soldiers, and so forth. He can indicate when and when not to use any given medium. He can, in conjunction with operations and intelligence officers, plan the full use of all available psychological resources. He can coordinate the timing of propaganda with military, economic, or political situations. The psychologist does not have to be present in person to give this advice. He does not have to be a man with an MD or PhD and years of postgraduate training. He can be present in the manuals he writes, in the indoctrination courses for psychological warfare officers he sets up, in the current propaganda line he dictates by radio. It is useful to have him in the field, particularly at the higher command headquarters, but he is not indispensable. The psychologist in person can be dispensed with. The methods of scientific psychology cannot. Further on, throughout this book, reference will be made to current psychological literature. The general history of psychology is described in readable terms in Gregory Zilborg and George W. Henry, A History of Medical Psychology, New York, 1941, and in Lowell S. Selling, Men Against Madness, New York, 1940, cheap edition, 1942. Propaganda can be conducted by rule of thumb, but only a genius can make it work well by playing his hunches. It can become true psychological warfare, scientific in spirit and developed as a teachable skill, only by having its premises clearly stated, its mission defined, its instruments put in systematic readiness, and its operations subject to at least partial check, only by the use of techniques borrowed from science. Of all the sciences, psychology is the nearest, though anthropology, sociology, political science, economics, area studies, and other specialties all have something to contribute, but it is psychology which indicates the need of the others. Psychological warfare as a part of war. An infantry officer does not need to study the whole nature of war in order to find his own job. Tradition, military skill, discipline, sound doctrine, these have done the job for him. Sun Tzu, Vigetius, Frederick, Clausewitz, and a host of lesser writers on war have established the place of combat in war and have appraised its general character. How much the traditional doctrines may be altered in the terrible light of atomic explosion, no one knows. But though the weapons are novel, the wielders of the weapons will still be men. The motives and weaknesses within war remain ancient and human, however novel and dreadful the mechanical expedients adopted to express them. Warfare as a whole is traditionally well defined, and psychological warfare can be understood only in relation to the whole process. It is no mere tool to be used on special occasion. It has become a pervasive element in the military and security situation of every power on earth. Psychological warfare is a part of war. The simplest, plainest thing which can be said of war, any sort of war, anywhere, any time, is that it is an official fight between men. Combat, killing, and even large-scale group struggle are known elsewhere in the animal kingdom, but war is not. All sorts of creatures fight, but only men declare, wage, and terminate war, and they do so only against other men. Formally, war may be defined as the reciprocal application of violence by public armed bodies. If it is not reciprocal, it is not war. The killing of persons who do not defend themselves is not war, but slaughter, massacre, or punishment. If the bodies involved are not public, their violence is not war. Even our enemies in World War II were relatively careful about this distinction, because they did not know how soon or easily a violation of the rules might be scored against them. To be public, the combatants need not be legal, that is, constitutionally set up. It suffices, according to international usage, for the fighters to have a reasonable minimum of numbers, some kind of identification, and a purpose which is political. If you shoot your neighbor, you will be committing mere murder. But if you gather 20 or 30 friends together, tie a red handkerchief around the left arm of each man, announce that you are out to overthrow the government of the United States, and then shoot your neighbor as a counter-revolutionary impediment to the new order of things, you can have the satisfaction of having waged war. In practical terms, this means that you will be put to death for treason and rebellion, not merely for murder. Finally, war must be violent. According to the law of modern states, all the way from Iceland to the Yemen, economic, political, or moral pressure is not war. War is the legalization in behalf of the state of things which no individual may lawfully do in time of peace. As a matter of fact, even in time of war, you cannot kill the enemy unless you do so on behalf of the state. If you had shot a Japanese creditor of yours privately, or even shot a Japanese soldier when you yourself were out of uniform, you might properly and lawfully have been put to death for murder, either by our courts or by the enemies. This is among the charges which recur in the war trials. The Germans and Japanese killed persons whom even war did not entitle them to kill. The governments of the modern world are jealous of their own monopoly of violence. War is the highest exercise of that violence, and modern war is no simple reversion to savagery. The general staffs would not be needed if war were only an uncomplicated orgy of homicide, a mere getting mad and throat-cutting season in the life of man. Quite to the contrary, modern war, as a function of modern society, reflects the institutional, political complexity from which it comes. A modern battle is a formal, ceremonialized, and technically intricate operation. You must kill just the right people, in just the right way, with the right timing, in the proper place, for avowed purposes. Otherwise, you make a mess of the whole show, and what is worse, you lose. Why must you fight just so-and-so, there and not here, now and not then? The answer is simple. You are fighting against men. Your purpose in fighting is to make them change their minds. It is figuratively true to say that the war we have just won was a peculiar kind of advertising campaign designed to make the Germans and Japanese like us and our way of doing things. They did not like us much, but we gave them alternatives far worse than liking us, so that they became peaceful. Sometimes individuals will be unpersuadable. Then they must be killed or neutralized by other purely physical means, such as isolation or imprisonment. Some Nazis, perhaps including the Führer himself, found our world repellent or incomprehensible and died because they could not make themselves surrender. In the Pacific, many Japanese had to be killed before they became acceptable to us. But such is man, that most individuals will stop fighting at some point short of extinction. That point is reached when one of two things happens. Either the defeated people may lose their sense of organization, fail to decide on leaders and methods, and give up because they can no longer fight as a group. This happened to the American Southerners in April 1865. The President and Cabinet of the Confederate States of America got on the train at Richmond. The men who got off farther down the line were refugees. Something happened to them and to the people about them, so that Mr. Davis no longer thought of himself as President Davis, and other people no longer accepted his commands. This almost happened in Germany in 1945, except for Admiral Donitz. Or, the defeated people can retain their sense of organization and can use their political organization for the purpose of getting in touch with the enemy, arranging the end of the war, and preparing, through organized means, to comply with the wishes of the conquerors. That happened when Britain acknowledged American independence. When the Boers recognized British sovereignty, when Finland signed what Russia had dictated, and when Japan gave up. Sometimes these things are mixed. The people might wish to make peace, but may find that their government is not recognized by the enemy, or the victors may think that they have smashed the enemy government, when the new organization is simply the old one under a slightly different name, but with the old leaders and the old ideas still prevailing. It is plain that whatever happens, wars are fought to effect a psychological change in the antagonist. They are then fought for a psychological end, unless they are wars of extermination. These are rare. The United States could not find a people on the face of the earth whose ideas and language were unknown to all Americans. Where there is a chance of communication, there is always the probability that one of the antagonistic organizations, governments, which have already cooperated to the extent of meeting one another's wishes to fight, will subsequently cooperate on terms of primary advantage to the victors. Since the organizations comprise human beings with human ways of doing things, the change must take place in the minds of those specific individuals who operate the existing government, or in the minds of enough other people for that government to be overthrown. The fact that war is waged against the minds, not the bodies, of the enemy is attested by the comments of military writers of all periods. The dictum of Karl von Clausewitz that war is politics continued by other means is simply the modern expression of a truth recognized since antiquity. War is a kind of persuasion, uneconomical, dangerous, and unpleasant, but effective when all else fails. Ideology. An ideology is a system of deep-rooted beliefs about fundamental questions in human life and affairs. Ideology also plays a part in psychological warfare. A difference in beliefs which does not touch fundamentals is commonly termed a difference of opinion. You may believe in high tariffs, and I in no tariff. You may believe in one world, I may not. You may support Republicans, I Democrats. Despite these differences, both of us can still believe in dollars as a method of paying income, in marriage as a system of setting up the family, in private property for most goods, industrial or personal, in the government of the United States, in majority rule, in democratic elections, in free speech, and so on. If our difference of opinion is so inclusive that we can agree on nothing political, our differences have gone from mere opinion into the depths of ideology. Here the institutional framework is affected. You and I would not want to live in the same city. We could not feel safe in one another's presence. Each would be afraid of the effect which the other might have on the morals of the community. If I were a Nazi and you a Democrat, you would not like the idea of my children living next door to yours. If I believed that you were a good enough creature, poor deluded devil, but that you were not fit to vote, scarcely to be trusted with property, not to be trusted as an army officer, and generally subversive and dangerous, you would find it hard to get along with me. It was not metaphysical theories that made Protestants and Catholics burn one another's adherents as heretics in early wars. In the 17th century, the Protestants knew perfectly well what would happen if the Catholics got the upper hand, and the Catholics knew what would happen if the Protestants came to power. In each case, the new rulers, fearful that they might be overthrown, would have suppressed the former rulers, and would have used the rack, the stake, and the dungeon as preventives of counter-revolution. Freedom cannot be accorded to persons outside the ideological pale. If an antagonist is not going to respect your freedom of speech, your property, and your personal safety, then you are not obliged to respect his. The absolute minimum of any ideology is the assumption that each person living in an ideologically uniform area, what the Nazi general Haushofer, following Rudolf Kellen, would call a geopsychic zone, will respect the personal safety, etc., of other individuals in the same area. In our own time, we have seen Spaniards get more and more mistrustful of one another, until years of ferocious civil war were necessary before one of the two factions could feel safe. Spain went from republican unity to dictatorial unity in 4 years. In neither case was the unity perfect, but it was enough to give one government and one educational system control of most of the country. The other countries of the world vary in the degree of their ideological cohesion. Scandinavia seemed serene until the German invasion brought to the surface cleavages, latent and unseen, which made quisling a quisling. Russia, Italy, Germany, and various other states have made a fetish of their ideologies and have tried to define orthodoxy and heresy in such a way as to be sure of the mentality of all their people. But most of the countries of the world suffer from a considerable degree of ideological confusion, of instability of basic beliefs, without having any immediate remedy at hand, or even seeking one. Education. Education is a process, usually institutional, by which the people of a given area transmit to their successors, their own children, the purely practical information needed in modern life, together with a lot of other teachings designed to make good men and women, good citizens, good Christians or other believers of them. In the democratic states, this process is ideological only in some parts of the curriculum. Elsewhere in the field of opinions, the government seeks to control ideology only negatively through laws concerning obscenity, blasphemy, subversion, and so on. In the states which are ideologically self-conscious and anxious to promote a fixed mentality, the process of education is combined with agitation and regulation, so that the entire population lives under conditions approximating the psychological side of war. Heretics are put to death or are otherwise silenced. Historical materialism and the Marxian objectivity, or the Volk, or fascismo, or Yamato Damashi, or New Democracy is set up as the touchstone of all good and evil, even in unrelated fields of activity. Education and propaganda merge into everlasting indoctrination. And when such states go to war against states which do not have propaganda machinery, the more liberal states are at a disadvantage for sheer lack of practice in the administrative and mechanical aspects of propaganda. Education is to psychological warfare what a glacier is to an avalanche. The mind is to be in both cases captured, but the speed and techniques differ. Salesmanship. Salesmanship is related to psychological warfare. Propaganda is often compared to another art of our time, industrialized salesmanship through mass printing and telecommunications. This bad parallel was responsible for much of the inept American propaganda overseas in the early part of the war. Some of our propagandists had a fundamental misconception of the nature of wartime propaganda. Allegiance in war is a matter of ideology, not of opinion. A man cannot want his own side to lose while remaining a good citizen in all other respects. The desire for defeat, even the acceptance of defeat, is of tragic importance to any responsible, sane person. A German who wanted the Reich to be overthrown was a traitor to Germany, just as any American who wished us to pull out of the war and exterminate American Jews would have been a traitor to his own country. These decisions cannot be compared with the choice of a toothpaste, a deodorant, or a cigarette. Advertising succeeds in peacetime precisely because it does not matter. The choice which the consumer makes is of slight importance to himself, even though it is of importance to the seller of the product. A dromedary cigarette and an old coin cigarette are both cigarettes. The man is going to smoke one anyhow. It does not matter so much to him. If dromedaries are associated in his mind with mere tobacco, while old coins call up unaccountable but persistent memories of actresses' legs, he may buy old coins. The physical implements of propaganda were at hand in 1941 to 1942, but we Americans had become so accustomed to their use for trivial purposes that much of our wartime propaganda was conducted in terms of salesmanship. In a sense, however, salesmanship does serve the military purpose of accustoming the audience to appeals both visual and auditory. The consequence is that competing outside propaganda can reach the domestic American audience only in competition with the local advertising. It is difficult for foreign competition to hold attention amid an almost limitless number of professionally competent commercial appeals. A communist or fascist party cannot get public attention in the United States by the simple expedient of a mass meeting of 300 persons or by the use of a few dozen posters in a metropolitan area. Before the political propagandist can get the public attention, he must edge his media past the soap operas, the soft drink advertisements, the bathing beauties advertising Pennsylvania crude or bright leaf tobacco. The consequence is that outside propaganda either fails to get much public attention or else camouflages itself to resemble and to exploit existing media. Clamorous salesmanship deadens the American citizen to his own government's propaganda and may to a certain extent lower his civic alertness. But at the same time, salesmanship has built up a psychological great wall which excludes foreign or queer appeals and which renders the United States almost impervious to sudden ideological penetration from overseas. Psychological warfare and public relations. Psychological warfare and public relations are different in the direction in which they apply. Psychological warfare is designed to reach the enemy. Public relations is designed primarily to reach the home audience. Both reach neutrals, sometimes confusingly much. In some nations, the two functions were combined in a single instrumentality, as in the Japanese Joho Kyoku, see below. The American Army and Navy traditions of public relations are based on the ideas that the news should be as complete as military security may permit, that it should be delivered speedily and interestingly, that it should enhance the confidence of the people in their armed services, and that its tenor, no less than its contents, should not aid the enemy morale. These ideas are justified in terms of sound newspaper practice, but they can lead to a weak psychological warfare position when we must deal with an inventive and enterprising enemy. It is not possible to separate public relations from psychological warfare when they use the same media. During World War II, the Office of War Information prepared elaborate watertight plans for processing war news to different audiences. At their most unfortunate, such plans seemed to assume that the enemy would listen only to the WWII stations, and that the American public releases issued from Army and Navy would go forth to the world without being noted by the enemy. If a radio in New York or San Francisco presented a psychological warfare presentation of a stated battle or engagement, while the theater or fleet public relations officer presented a very different view, the enemy press and radio were free to choose the weaker of the two, or to quote the two American sources against each other. Psychological warfare and morale services. All modern armies, in addition to public relations, also employ morale services facilities. Officers or employees whose function it is to supply troops with entertainment, educational materials, political indoctrination, and other attention-getting materials. Morale services are the prime overt defense against enemy psychological warfare, and by a program of keeping the attention of the troops can prevent the enemy from establishing effective communication. During World War II, the Armed Forces Radio Service of the United States established global radio service for Americans, and incidentally turned out material of top importance to United States propaganda. Naturally, enemy and allied peoples would pay more serious heed to communications from Americans to Americans than they would to materials which they knew had been concocted for themselves. The American morale services in the last war indignantly rejected the notion that they were a major propaganda facility, rightfully insisting that their audience counted on getting plain information, plain news, and plain education without ulterior propaganda content. The fact that in a theater of war, all communication has propaganda effect was not always taken into account, and only on one or two critical occasions was there coordination of stress and timing. It must be said, however, that propaganda by any other name is just as sweet, and that the conviction of the propagandist that he is not a propagandist can be a real asset. Morale services provided the American forces with news, entertainment, and educational facilities. Most of the time, these morale facilities had huge parasitical audiences. The global kibitzers who listened to our broadcasts, read our magazines, bought our paper-bound books on the black markets. It was a happy day for Lienta University at Kunming, Yunnan, when the American Information and Education setup began shipping in current literature. The long-isolated Chinese college students found themselves deluged with good American books. The morale services lost the opportunity to ram home to their GI plus foreign audience some of the more effective points of American psychological warfare, but they gained as propagandists by not admitting, even to themselves, that they were propagandists. Since the United States has no serious inward psychological cleavages, The general morale services function coordinated automatically with the psychological warfare function simply because both were produced by disciplined, patriotic Americans. In the experience of the German and Soviet armies, morale services were parts of a coordinated propaganda machine, which included psychological warfare, public relations, general news, and public education. In the Japanese armies, morale services were directed most particularly to physical and sentimental comforts, edible treats, picture postcards, good luck items, which bore little immediate relation to news and less to formal propaganda. Related civilian activities. In a free nation, the big media of communication will remain uncoordinated even in time of war. The press, the stage, motion pictures, part of the radio, book publishing, and so on will continue. Psychological warfare has in such private facilities a constantly refreshed source of new material for news or for features. By a sparing but well-considered liaison with censorship, psychological warfare can effect negative control of non-governmental materials and can prevent the most overt forms of enemy propaganda from circulating on the home front. News becomes propaganda when the person issuing it has some purpose in doing so. Even if the reporters, editors, writers involved do not have propaganda aims, the original source of the news, the person giving the interview, the friends of the correspondents, etc., may give the news to the press with definite purposes in mind. It is not unknown for government officials to shift their rivalries from the conference room to the press and to provide on-the-record or off-the-record materials which are in effect ad hoc propaganda campaigns. A psychological warfare campaign must be planned on the assumption that these civilian facilities will remain in being and that they will be uncoordinated. The plan must allow an advance for interference, sometimes of a very damaging kind, which comes from private operations in the same field. The combat officers can get civilian cars off the road when moving armored forces into battle, but the psychological warfare officer has the difficult task of threading his way through civilian radio and other communication traffic over which he has no control. Psychological warfare is also closely related to diplomacy. It is an indispensable ingredient of strategic deception. In the medical field, psychological warfare can profit by the experiences of the medical corps. Whenever a given condition arises among troops on one side, comparable troops on the other are apt to be facing the same condition. If the Americans are bitten by insects, the same insects will bite the enemy, and enemy soldiers can be told how much better the American facilities are for insect repulsion. Finally, psychological warfare is intimately connected with the processing of prisoners of war and with the protection of one's own captured personnel. Psychological warfare is a field to itself, although it touches on many sciences and overlaps with all the other functions of war. It is generally divisible into three topics: the general scheme of psychological warfare, the detection and analysis of foreign psychological warfare operations, and the tactical or immediate conduct of psychological warfare. Sections of this book deal with each of these in turn. In each case, it must be remembered, however, that psychological warfare is not a closed operation which can be conducted in private, but that, to be effective, psychological warfare output must be a part of the everyday living and fighting of the audiences to which it is directed.
This concludes today's reading of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.